My date explained why women can't understand complex sports strategy. I've been coaching professional teams for 12 years. Derek set down his wine glass and leaned forward with the confidence of someone about to share a profound truth. We were 20 minutes into our second date, and he'd just started explaining why the defensive coordinator for his favorite football team, my team, was clearly incompetent. The play calling in last Sunday's game had been atrocious, he said, predictable and poorly timed. Any competent coordinator would have adjusted to the offensive formation they were facing. He used terms like cover 3 and zone blitz with the certainty of someone who'd watched thousands of games from his couch and genuinely believed that made him an expert. I took a sip of the wine he'd ordered without asking my preference and let him continue, curious how far this would go before I told him the truth. He pulled out his phone and showed me diagrams he'd apparently drawn himself, crude X's and O's representing players and formations I'd designed. The defensive coordinator, he explained while gesturing at his screen, should have brought pressure up the middle instead of from the edges, should have trusted the secondary to handle one-on-one matchups. Every suggestion he made was something I'd actually considered during that game and rejected for specific tactical reasons he couldn't possibly understand. Our starting defensive tackle had been playing with a torn ligament in his hand, information we hadn't disclosed to the media. Our strong safety had been in concussion protocol until Friday. Their offensive coordinator had done excellent work identifying our tendencies. But Derek didn't know any of this, couldn't know any of this, because he was a fan playing coach in his imagination. Then he said something that made my jaw tighten. The real problem with professional coaching, he announced while cutting his steak with surgical precision, was that it had become too political, too focused on diversity hires and media optics rather than actual competence. Women, specifically, had no business in coaching positions beyond maybe handling administrative tasks, because the female brain simply wasn't wired for the kind of complex spatial reasoning and rapid strategic adjustment that football required. He said this casually, like he was commenting on the weather, then took another sip of wine and smiled at me like he'd just shared an obvious truth that I should appreciate. I set down my fork carefully and asked him if he really believed women were biologically incapable of understanding sports strategy. Derek's eyes lit up like I'd just asked him to solve a puzzle he'd been dying to share. He launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about testosterone and cognitive differences, about how men had evolved as hunters who needed to track moving targets and predict patterns, while women had evolved to gather plants and nurture children. He mentioned some podcast he'd been listening to, some guy with a background in evolutionary psychology who apparently confirmed all his biases. I watched his mouth move and realized this wasn't just casual ignorance. This was a deeply held belief system, something he'd constructed to make himself feel superior. Our server appeared to clear our plates, and Derek ordered dessert for both of us without asking what I wanted. He chose some chocolate thing with raspberry sauce, then continued his lecture about why the coaching staff of the team I worked for, though he still didn't know I was part of it, was fundamentally flawed. The defensive coordinator, he said while pointing his fork at me for emphasis, was probably a token hire meant to generate positive press. Someone who looked good in press conferences but couldn't actually do the job when it mattered. He said this while looking directly at me, oblivious to the irony, oblivious to the fact that he was insulting the woman sitting across from him, who had forgotten more about football strategy than he would ever learn. I interrupted him mid-sentence and asked if he knew my full name. Derek looked confused by the question, the fork stopping halfway to his mouth. He admitted he'd just been calling me Alex, which was the name on my dating profile. I told him my last name was Kensington, and I watched his face for recognition. Nothing registered, so I added that I was Alexandra Kensington, and that I'd been the defensive coordinator for the team he loved for the past 4 seasons. I pulled out my phone and showed him my official team ID, the one with my photo and title clearly printed. I showed him pictures from the sideline, me wearing a headset and holding a play-calling sheet, standing next to the head coach during games. Derek's face went through several colors in rapid succession, starting with red, transitioning to a sickly pale, then settling on a blotchy combination of both. He set down his fork and pushed away his dessert like the chocolate mousse had personally offended him. He stammered something about not knowing, about how the team didn't really publicize their coordinators, about how he'd never seen me on camera during broadcasts. I reminded him that he'd just spent the last 30 minutes explaining why I was incompetent at my job, why women like me were ruining professional sports with our inferior female brains. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet around us. Or maybe that was just my perception as I watched him realize exactly how badly he'd miscalculated this evening. Derek tried to recover, said he obviously hadn't meant me specifically, that I was clearly an exception to the general rule. I asked him how many female coordinators he'd actually met to establish this general rule. He admitted I was the first, which meant his entire worldview about women in coaching was based on exactly 0 personal experience and a podcast hosted by someone who probably also had 0 personal experience. I leaned back in my chair and suggested he might want to reconsider his theories about female cognitive abilities. I pointed out that the play he'd criticized in the third quarter, the one he called predictable, had actually forced their offense into a situation where they had to burn their final timeout, which gave us a crucial advantage later in the game. Every decision he'd questioned had been part of a larger strategic framework he couldn't see because he was watching from a bar stool, drunk on beer and unfounded confidence. I asked Derek if he wanted to know why we'd really lost last Sunday's game. He nodded, looking like a student called on by a teacher when he hadn't done the reading. I explained the injuries we were managing, the adjustments I'd made at halftime, the trick play their coordinator had installed specifically to exploit a tendency we'd shown on film. Sometimes you make the right decision and still lose, I told him, which was a reality he'd never had to face in his fantasy world where every game was simple and every mistake was obvious from the comfort of a living room. Derek looked thoroughly deflated now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated like steam from his untouched coffee. He started apologizing, his words tumbling over each other in his rush to backtrack. He said he'd had too much wine, that he sometimes got carried away when talking about sports, that he clearly didn't know what he was talking about. I told him the wine wasn't the problem. The problem was his willingness to confidently dismiss the capabilities of half the human population based on nothing but his own assumptions. I asked him if he talked this way about women in other professions, if he assumed female doctors didn't understand medicine, if he thought female lawyers couldn't grasp legal strategy. Derek said of course not, that was different, but he couldn't articulate why. I suggested it was because he thought he understood football, thought his years of watching from the couch gave him expertise, which made him feel entitled to judge the people actually doing the work. I stood up from the table and dropped $200 in cash next to my plate, more than enough to cover my half of the meal and tip, because I didn't want to owe him anything. Derek started to say something, but I walked away before he could finish. I heard him call my name as I reached the restaurant door, but I didn't turn around. Outside, the night air was cold and clean, washing away the suffocating atmosphere of that dinner. I walked to my car in the parking garage, my heels clicking against the concrete, and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes just breathing. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant coach asking about some adjustments for Monday's practice. I responded with detailed instructions, losing myself in the familiar comfort of football strategy, problems that had actual solutions. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, letting the wind clear my head, and tried to remember why I'd thought dating was worth the effort. My apartment was dark when I arrived, just the way I'd left it hours ago, when I'd been foolish enough to think tonight might be pleasant. My German Shepherd, Captain, greeted me at the door with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging so hard his entire back end moved with the momentum. I changed out of my dress and heels into sweatpants and a team hoodie, then took Captain for a long walk around my neighborhood while I called my best friend Rachel. She was a trauma surgeon at the university hospital, one of the few people in my life who understood what it was like to be a woman in a male-dominated field where everyone assumed you were less competent until you proved otherwise. I told Rachel about Derek and his theories about female cognitive limitations, and she laughed so hard I heard her snort over the phone. She said she'd encountered a similar guy last month, someone who'd tried to explain surgical technique to her at a hospital fundraiser, not knowing she'd performed over 3,000 successful operations. We talked for 40 minutes while I walked Captain through the quiet streets, past houses with lit windows where families were watching television or putting kids to bed, living normal lives that didn't involve being lectured about your own profession by strangers on dating apps. Rachel asked if I was going to keep trying with the apps or give up for a while, and I told her I honestly didn't know. Dating at 38, with my career, felt like navigating a minefield where half the men were intimidated by successful women, and the other half were convinced they were smarter than us, despite all evidence to the contrary. When I got home, I made tea and opened my laptop to review the game footage I'd been planning to watch before Derek had ruined my evening. The opponent we were facing this week ran a complex offensive scheme that required careful preparation, and I needed to identify their tendencies so I could design the right defensive packages. I watched their quarterback's eyes, tracked how their receivers ran their routes, noted the subtle shifts in their offensive line that telegraphed whether they were running or passing. This was the work I loved, the puzzle-solving aspect of football that had drawn me to coaching in the first place. I'd played soccer in college, had been good enough to get scholarship offers, and I'd transitioned into coaching because I couldn't imagine my life without sports. I'd started as a volunteer assistant at a high school, then worked my way up to a college position, then finally got my break when the head coach of a professional team had taken a chance on me 12 years ago. He'd been old school in many ways, but he'd believed that good coaching transcended gender, that if you understood the game and could communicate effectively with players, nothing else mattered. He'd retired 5 years ago, but his mentorship had given me the foundation I needed to succeed at this level. The current head coach, Victor Brennan, had kept me on when he'd taken over, had even promoted me to defensive coordinator after our previous coordinator had left for another job. Victor trusted my judgment completely, which was why our defense had been ranked in the top 5 for 3 consecutive years. My phone buzzed around midnight with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won, and I opened the message. It was Derek, writing a long apology that somehow managed to center himself in his feelings rather than acknowledging the actual harm of his words. He said he felt terrible about what he'd said, that he hoped I could forgive him, that maybe we could start over because he thought we had a real connection. I read it twice, amazed at his ability to miss the point so completely. There was no real connection. There had never been a real connection, because Derek didn't see me as a person with expertise and experience worth respecting. He saw me as a woman first, which meant whatever else I accomplished was secondary to my gender, something to be explained away as an exception, rather than recognized as evidence that his entire worldview was garbage. I deleted the message without responding and went to bed. Captain curled up at my feet like he did every night. I lay in the dark thinking about all the Dereks I'd encountered over the years. All the men who'd assumed I was someone's girlfriend or a social media coordinator rather than a coach, who'd explained basic football concepts to me like I'd never heard them before, who'd questioned my credentials and my competence until I'd proven myself over and over again. I thought about the player early in my career who'd refused to listen to my coaching until the head coach had publicly backed me, who'd later apologized and said I was the best position coach he'd ever had. I thought about the sports radio host who'd spent an entire segment explaining why women couldn't handle the pressure of professional coaching, then had to publicly eat his words when we'd won the championship. Monday morning arrived with cold rain that matched my mood perfectly. I drove to the team facility early, wanting to get extra preparation done before the staff meeting. The building was mostly empty at 6 in the morning, just security guards and a few players who came in early for treatment on injuries. My office was set up exactly the way I liked it, with whiteboards covering 3 walls where I could diagram plays and formations, a large monitor for watching film, and a standing desk because sitting for hours made my back ache. Photos of my family lined one shelf, including one of me and my father at my first championship parade, both of us grinning while confetti fell around us. He'd passed away 2 years ago from a sudden heart attack, and I still felt his absence every day. Victor arrived at 7, stopping by my office with coffee from the place across the street that we both preferred. He was in his mid-50s, a former linebacker who'd transitioned into coaching after his playing career ended, and he'd built his reputation on being a straight shooter who didn't tolerate nonsense. He asked about my weekend, and I briefly mentioned the disastrous date without going into details. Victor shook his head and said dating was probably easier when he was young, though he'd been married to his college sweetheart for 30 years, so what did he know? We moved on to discussing this week's game plan, the adjustments we needed to make, the personnel decisions we were facing. Our starting cornerback was questionable with an ankle injury, which meant we might need to rely more on zone coverage, rather than our usual man-to-man scheme. The defensive staff meeting started at 8, with my position coaches arriving with their own coffee and notes. We spent 2 hours breaking down film, identifying tendencies, debating the best approach. My defensive line coach thought we should bring more pressure, try to rattle their young quarterback. My secondary coach wanted to play more conservatively, protect against the deep ball. I listened to both arguments, weighed the evidence, and made the call that I thought gave us the best chance of success. That was my job, to synthesize all the information, to trust my instincts honed over years of study and experience, to make the hard decisions and live with the consequences. These men, all former players themselves, respected me because I'd earned it, because I knew what I was talking about. Practice started at 10, and I stood on the sideline with my play-calling sheet, watching our defense execute the schemes we'd installed. The players called me Coach K, a nickname that had stuck early in my tenure, and they responded to my coaching because they knew I could help them improve, help them win. Our middle linebacker, a 6-year veteran named Deshaun Collins, came over during a water break and asked about a specific coverage adjustment. We talked through the reasoning, and he nodded, understanding the strategic logic. Deshaun had been skeptical of me when I first joined the staff, had admitted later that he'd assumed I was a diversity hire who didn't know football. But I'd proven myself in meetings, in games, until my gender became irrelevant, and my coaching ability became the only thing that mattered. After practice, I stayed late reviewing more film, preparing for our evening meeting where we'd finalize the game plan. My phone buzzed with another text from Derek, this one saying he'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to take me to dinner again to prove he wasn't the person I thought he was. I blocked his number this time, tired of his attempts to rehabilitate his image in my eyes. The truth was, Derek probably wasn't a terrible person in most contexts, but his certainty about women's limitations revealed something fundamental about how he saw the world, and that wasn't something that could be fixed over another dinner. I'd learned over the years that you couldn't argue people out of positions they hadn't reasoned themselves into, that deeply held biases were rarely changed by evidence or experience. Wednesday brought unexpected complications when our starting defensive tackle, Marcus Thornton, came into my office and closed the door behind him. Marcus was 31, a Pro Bowl caliber player who'd been with the team for 8 years, and the serious expression on his face told me this wasn't a casual visit. He sat down across from my desk and said he needed to tell me something that might affect his availability for Sunday's game. I waited, and Marcus explained that his ex-wife was threatening to file for full custody of their daughter unless he agreed to her financial demands, which were substantial and unreasonable. She knew he couldn't miss games during the season, knew his career depended on being available, and she was using that leverage to extract concessions. The court hearing was scheduled for Friday, which meant he'd miss practice. I asked Marcus if he had a good lawyer, and he said yes, but the system favored mothers in custody disputes, even when they were clearly acting in bad faith. His ex had a history of using their daughter as a weapon, of making threats and demands that had nothing to do with the child's welfare and everything to do with punishing Marcus for the divorce. I told him to take whatever time he needed for the hearing, that we'd adjust the game plan if necessary, that his daughter was more important than football. Marcus looked relieved, probably expecting me to be angry about the disruption to our preparation. But I'd been in this job long enough to know that players were human beings with complicated lives, that treating them with empathy and respect made them play harder for you, not softer. Thursday's practice was intense, our players understanding that Sunday's game could determine our playoff positioning. I ran them through situational drills, preparing them for the critical moments that often decided close games. During a break, Victor pulled me aside and said the team owner wanted to meet with us after practice. My stomach tightened because unscheduled meetings with ownership rarely meant good news. Victor said he didn't know what it was about, but his tone suggested he had suspicions. We finished practice and walked together to the administrative offices, neither of us speaking, both running through possible scenarios. The owner, Richard Castellano, was in his 60s, a self-made billionaire who'd bought the team 15 years ago and generally let his football people make football decisions. Richard got straight to the point, saying he'd received several calls over the past few days from season ticket holders and donors, complaining about the team's commitment to winning. Apparently, some fans felt we were too focused on progressive politics and not focused enough on results, despite the fact that we'd won a championship 3 years ago and been competitive every season since. Richard said he wasn't questioning our approach, but he needed to be aware of these concerns because they affected the business side of the organization. Victor asked if this was about me specifically, and Richard hesitated before admitting that some of the complaints had mentioned our defensive coordinator, questioning whether the position should be held by someone with a different background. The careful language didn't hide the meaning. They wanted a man in my job, regardless of my qualifications or results. I felt anger rising in my chest but forced myself to stay calm. I asked Richard if these complainants could name a specific strategic failure on my part, a game we'd lost because of my coaching. Richard admitted they couldn't, that their complaints were more general, more about optics than actual performance. Victor jumped in, his voice hard, saying that I was one of the best coordinators in the league, that our defensive rankings proved it, that replacing me would be idiotic and wrong. Richard raised his hands defensively and said he wasn't suggesting any changes, just making us aware of the feedback he was receiving. I asked him directly if he believed I was qualified for my job, if he trusted my coaching ability. Richard looked uncomfortable but said yes, absolutely, that he had complete confidence in me. The meeting ended awkwardly, and Victor and I walked back to the coaching offices in silence. Finally, Victor said that Richard was weak, that he should have shut down those complaints immediately, instead of giving them oxygen by bringing them to us. I agreed but said I understood the position Richard was in, that pleasing wealthy donors was part of his job even when those donors were wrong. Victor said that if the team ever tried to fire me, he'd quit, that he wouldn't work for an organization that caved to bigotry. I appreciated the loyalty but told him not to make promises he might not be able to keep, that careers were complicated and sometimes you had to make compromises. Victor shook his head and said some things weren't negotiable, that integrity mattered more than job security. Friday morning brought better news when Marcus texted that his custody hearing had gone well, that the judge had seen through his ex-wife's manipulations and maintained the existing arrangement. He'd be available for the game on Sunday, ready to play with a clear head. I was relieved, both for Marcus personally and for our game plan, which worked better with him on the field. I spent Friday afternoon in final preparations, installing some wrinkles we'd been saving for this opponent, making sure every player understood their responsibilities. The energy in our defensive meeting room was good, focused, and confident, exactly what I wanted going into a crucial game. Saturday brought an unexpected visitor to my office. I was reviewing some last-minute adjustments when security called to say someone was asking for me at the front desk, claiming to be a friend but refusing to give a name. Annoyed at the interruption, I walked down to the lobby and found Derek standing there in team gear, a jersey and hat that marked him as a fan. My irritation spiked immediately, and I asked him what he was doing here. Derek said he needed to apologize properly, face to face, that his texts hadn't felt adequate. I told him this was my workplace, that showing up unannounced was inappropriate and creepy. Derek looked hurt, said he'd driven an hour to get here, that he deserved a chance to explain himself. Security was watching our exchange, ready to intervene if needed, and I saw one of the guards reaching for his radio. Derek apparently sensed the situation deteriorating because he started backing toward the door, saying he just wanted me to know he'd learned from our conversation, that he'd been doing research about women in coaching, that he realized he'd been wrong. I told him that personal growth was wonderful, but it didn't entitle him to my time or attention, that he needed to leave and not contact me again. Derek opened his mouth to argue, but I turned and walked back toward the offices, not giving him another opportunity to speak. I heard the security guard firmly telling Derek he needed to leave the property. Heard Derek's protest fade as I moved deeper into the building. Back in my office, I sat down and took several deep breaths, trying to release the tension in my shoulders. I called Rachel and told her about Derek's surprise visit. She was horrified, asked if I wanted her to come over, if I felt safe. I assured her I was fine, that building security was excellent, and Derek seemed more pathetic than dangerous. But his inability to respect boundaries was concerning. Rachel suggested I might want to file a police report, create a paper trail in case Derek escalated. I said I'd think about it, though part of me resisted because I'd been trained my entire career not to make waves, not to seem difficult or emotional. But Rachel was right that documenting inappropriate behavior was smart, especially when it happened at my workplace. The officer who took my report was professional but skeptical, asking multiple times if Derek had actually threatened me or just made me uncomfortable. I explained the timeline, the rejected date, the blocked number, the appearance at my workplace despite being told to leave me alone. The officer said it didn't quite meet the threshold for a restraining order, but agreed to document everything and increase patrols near my apartment and the team facility. He asked if Derek knew where I lived, and I realized with a cold feeling that he probably did, that my address had likely been accessible through some document, or maybe he'd just followed me home one night when I hadn't been paying attention. The officer saw my expression change and asked if I wanted to stay somewhere else for a few days. I decided I wasn't going to be driven from my own home by a man who couldn't handle rejection. Sunday morning arrived clear and cold, perfect football weather. I drove to the stadium 4 hours before kickoff, my usual routine, and parked in the secured lot where fans weren't allowed. Inside, the facility hummed with pregame energy, players arriving with their headphones and focused expressions, coaches making final adjustments. I went through my game plan one last time, visualizing how our defense would respond to different offensive looks, preparing myself mentally for the rapid decisions I'd need to make. Victor stopped by my office and asked if I was ready, and I nodded, feeling that familiar pregame mixture of nervousness and excitement. This was what I lived for. The competition, the strategy, the chance to test myself against another coordinator's schemes. The game started badly when their offense marched down the field on the opening drive, exploiting a coverage bust that was entirely my fault for not communicating the adjustment clearly. They scored a touchdown, and I felt the familiar gut punch of failure, the knowledge that my mistake had put us behind. But I learned over years of coaching that you couldn't dwell on failures, that you had to adjust and move forward. I made the necessary correction, and our defense settled in, forcing 3 consecutive punts. By halftime, we'd taken the lead, our offense capitalizing on the field position our defense was providing. I spent the break making more adjustments, identifying new tendencies their offense had shown. The third quarter was a defensive struggle, neither team able to generate much offense. Then their coordinator made a brilliant call, a trick play we hadn't seen on film, and they scored to tie the game. I had to admire the creativity even as I cursed myself for not anticipating it. With 8 minutes left, we got a crucial stop on 4th down, and our offense took over in good field position. They kicked a field goal to give us a 3-point lead, which meant our defense needed one more stop to secure the win. Their offense came out aggressive, and I called a coverage designed to prevent the deep ball while defending the middle of the field. It worked perfectly, our pass rush getting home, forcing their quarterback into a rushed throw that fell incomplete on 4th down. The crowd erupted as our offense took over to run out the clock, and I felt the relief and satisfaction of a hard-fought victory. Players were hugging each other on the sideline, and several came over to thank me for the game plan. Victor grabbed me in a bear hug and said that was championship-level coaching. The post-game media session was crowded with reporters asking questions about key plays and strategic decisions. One reporter asked if I felt extra pressure as the league's only female coordinator, and I gave my standard response about focusing on football rather than gender, about being judged on results. In the locker room afterward, while players showered and celebrated, I sat in my office reviewing the game footage, already looking for areas where we could improve. Monday morning's film session revealed some mistakes we'd made, things we'd gotten away with because our opponent hadn't capitalized. I showed the team these moments, explaining what could have gone wrong, how we needed to be sharper going forward. The players listened attentively, understanding that good coaching meant being honest about both successes and failures. This was the relationship I'd built with them over years, a foundation of trust that transcended whatever prejudices they might have brought initially. They didn't think of me as a female coach anymore, just as their coach, the person responsible for preparing them and putting them in position to win. That afternoon brought an email from Derek, sent to my professional address that he must have found on the team website. The subject line said, "Please read," and I almost deleted it without opening, but something made me click. Inside was a rambling essay about his weekend, how he'd watched Sunday's game, and finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him at dinner, how watching me coach had opened his eyes to his own ignorance. He said he'd been reading books about women in sports, listening to different podcasts, trying to educate himself. The email ended with another apology and a request to talk, just as friends, no romantic expectations. I read it twice, trying to determine if Derek was genuine or just persistent in his delusion. The truth was probably somewhere in between. A man who was legitimately trying to grow, but who still centered himself in the narrative, who still wanted credit for doing the bare minimum of recognizing my humanity. I drafted a brief response saying I appreciated his efforts to educate himself, but that I wasn't interested in maintaining any relationship, that I needed him to respect my boundaries and stop contacting me. I sent it before I could second-guess myself, then blocked his email address the same way I'd blocked his phone number. Wednesday brought news that Richard Castellano wanted another meeting, this time with just me. I walked to his office with a knot in my stomach. Richard gestured to a chair and said he wanted to apologize for last week's meeting, that he'd handled it badly, that he should have immediately dismissed those complaints instead of treating them as legitimate feedback. He said he'd been thinking about it all weekend, especially after watching Sunday's game, and he realized that giving voice to prejudice was itself a form of prejudice. He said he was proud to have me on the coaching staff, that he wanted me to know I had his complete support. I appreciated the apology, but asked Richard what had changed between last week and today. He admitted that his daughter, who worked in sports marketing for another team, had called him after hearing about the meeting and given him a substantial piece of her mind about enabling sexism. She'd apparently pointed out that he'd built his business career on merit and competition, but he was willing to compromise those principles when it came to football because of some angry fans. Richard said his daughter was right, that he'd been a coward. I told him I didn't need promises, just action, that the next time someone questioned my qualifications, he needed to shut it down immediately rather than bringing it to me like it was my problem to solve. The rest of the week passed in the familiar rhythm of preparation and practice, game planning for our next opponent, correcting mistakes from the previous game. Marcus Thornton stopped by my office to thank me for being understanding about his custody situation, said it meant a lot that I'd prioritized his family over football. I told him that good coaching meant seeing players as whole people, not just bodies executing schemes. We talked for a while about his daughter, about co-parenting challenges, about finding balance in a career that demanded so much time and energy. These conversations, this human connection, was what made the job meaningful beyond just wins and losses. Saturday's practice was sharp, our players focused and ready for Sunday's game. After practice, several players stayed late to watch extra film, asking questions about specific situations, showing the kind of dedication that separated good teams from great ones. I loved these moments. The voluntary engagement, the intellectual curiosity about strategy. This was football at its best. Not the toxic masculinity that Derek and others associated with the sport, but collaboration and problem solving. Gender had nothing to do with it. Competence was all that mattered, and I'd built my career proving that truth over and over again. Sunday's game was dominant, our defense forcing 4 turnovers and holding their offense to a single touchdown. Everything clicked, players executing at a high level, my play calling working exactly as designed. We won by 17 points, and the post-game celebration was joyous, players dousing Victor and me with Gatorade while I laughed and raised my arms in triumph. Victor pulled me aside afterward and said this was some of the best coaching he'd seen, that I was at the peak of my abilities. I thanked him, but said there was always room to improve, always new wrinkles to install. That growth mindset, that refusal to be satisfied, was what had gotten me here. 3 months later, deep into playoff preparation, I got one final email from Derek. He'd created a new account to message me, saying he wanted me to know he'd gotten engaged to someone who worked in education, someone who'd helped him continue growing. He said he'd become an advocate for women in sports, that he regularly called out sexist comments in his friend group. He wanted to thank me for starting that process, even though our relationship had ended badly. The email acknowledged that I probably didn't care about any of this, but he needed to say it anyway. I read it once and didn't respond, just marked it as read and moved on. Derek's growth was not my responsibility or my achievement. Maybe he'd genuinely changed, or maybe he'd just gotten better at performing enlightenment. It didn't matter because my life had moved forward without him, focused on the work I loved, and the team that respected me, and the career I'd built through competence, rather than approval from men who'd initially doubted me. We won that playoff game and advanced to the conference championship. That was the story worth telling.